Welcome back to the deep dive. We always say we're here for those who, like us, just want to cut through the noise and really understand what's going on in the world, right? And, well, today we're diving into an incident that's, well, pretty layered. We're talking about that U.S. base commander who was just fired in Greenland.
Yeah, this whole story about Colonel Susan Meyers being relieved of her command at Pituffik Space Base. I mean, it might seem kind of simple at first glance, right? Like just a personnel issue. But trust me, the more we dig into this, the more you see just how tangled up this is with the U.S., Greenland, Denmark. Oh, and it even says some interesting things about, the U.S. military itself.
Exactly. That's what we're trying to uncover in this deep dive. Why was Colonel Meyers fired? And I think what's even more important for you listening is, what does this whole thing tell us about, the bigger picture? Geopolitics, how the U.S. military works. To get to the bottom of this, we've got a whole bunch of sources we're going to unpack, like news reports from BBC News, Sky News, Military.com, the Network Journal, Fair Observer, the usual suspects. We also took a look at what people are saying on Reddit. Those forums can be pretty insightful. And we have this really sharp analysis from Just Security to help us connect all the dots.
All right, so before we jump into the whole firing thing, let's get some background here. It's important to understand, Greenland itself and why the U.S. cares so much about it, right? So for 300 years now, Greenland has been under Danish control. But here's the kicker, and this is important to keep in mind. Since 2009, Greenland has had this right to call for an independence referendum, right? And you know what? A lot of Greenlanders, they actually want independence from Denmark.
And here's where things get really interesting.
Right.
Well, there's this push for independence from Denmark joining the U.S. Well, that's a whole other story. I mean, there was a poll by Varian earlier this year, and it showed that a whopping 85% of Greenlanders are not into becoming part of the U.S. So, yeah, they might want to go their own way, but it doesn't look like that way leads to state number 51 or anything.
And this is where things get really fascinating if you think about it. It's not just about the political future of Greenland, but its strategic importance, especially when you think about Pituffik Space Base. You might remember it as Thule Air Base, that's what it was called, until 2023 when they changed it to, reflect the connection with the U.S. Space Force and to use its traditional Greenlandic name. But this base has a pretty long history. Even back in the mid-1940s, they had a Danish-American radio station around there. Then in 1951, they had this big defense agreement that really solidified the U.S. military presence. That's when they created what they call the Thule Defense Area. But it's not just about geography, right? The Arctic region, and therefore Greenland, it's becoming really important these days. I mean, you've got melting ice opening up new shipping routes, potential access to all sorts of valuable resources. Oh, and it's also crucial for those missile early warning systems, which is one of the main things that Pituffik does.
So now, let's fast forward, right? March 28th, 2025. U.S. Vice President JD Vance goes and visits Pituffik Space Base. And, instead of just the usual diplomatic niceties, Vance decides to make some pretty blunt remarks about how Denmark is handling Greenland. He basically said Denmark's not investing enough in the people, in security, and he even went as far as to suggest that maybe Greenland will be better off with the U.S. calling the shots.
And if you're connecting the dots here, this really echoes what President Trump said a while back, about maybe buying Greenland. There's definitely a pattern here, the U.S. administration wanting a bigger, let's say, security footprint in the Arctic.
Yeah, and, well, maybe this won't surprise you, but Vance's comments didn't exactly go over well. The Danish foreign minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, he publicly criticized the whole tone of it. Yeah. He basically said that's not how allies should be talking to each other.
Right.
It definitely added some tension to the whole situation, let's just say that.
So the question is, where does Colonel Meyers fit into all of this? So just a few days after Vance's visit, on March 31st, Colonel Meyers sends out this email to everyone at Pituffik Space Base. Now, this email, and it was reported by Military.com, and the U.S. Space Force confirmed it was real, this is really the heart of the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. She didn't mince words. She straight up said that the, quote, concerns of the U.S. administration discussed by Vice President Vance on Friday are not reflective of Pituffik Space Base. And then, just to drive the point home, she emphasized how committed she is to all the flags and, I quote, flying proudly together, a clear shout out to those other countries, like Canada and Denmark, that have people working at the base.
So think about it. You have the commander of the super important base basically contradicting the vice president, in public no less. I mean, that's a bold move. And, well, the consequences were pretty swift. Around April 10th or 11th, the news breaks that she's been fired.
And the official reason? They said she undermined the chain of command and, get this, subverted President Trump's agenda. The Pentagon spokesman, Sean Parnell,
even went on X and directly tied her firing to, quote, actions that subvert President Trump's agenda. The U.S. Space Force also put out a statement emphasizing that commanders, and I quote, are expected to adhere to the highest standards of conduct, especially as it relates to remaining nonpartisan. So it seems like the Pentagon's view was that her email, well, it crossed the line and got too political. I mean, this idea of civilian control of the military, it's huge, right? It means that it's the elected civilian leaders, like the president or the secretary of defense, who set the direction for the military. And military leaders, they're expected to carry out those policies, even if they personally disagree. And some people, they saw Colonel Meyers' email as stepping outside of that role.
And you know what's really telling? It's the reactions this has sparked. You go on Reddit, and there are so many different opinions flying around. Some people are saying it's straight up censorship, even authoritarian. Others are arguing she was being insubordinate, that she wasn't thinking about the political implications. And, well, she kind of had it coming. There was even someone suggesting that this whole firing was just a way for the U.S. to get more aggressive with Greenland. What's interesting is just how divided people are on this. It shows you how people are struggling with this question. Is the military supposed to be completely neutral? Or do officers have some kind of duty to speak up, even if it goes against what the administration is saying?
It really is like a mini version of those big debates we see happening everywhere,
Yeah.
But not long after all that, with Vice President Vance, early April, the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, she heads over to Greenland. And in a show of solidarity, she appears with those Greenlandic leaders, Grans Fredrik Nielsen and Miteji, and she makes this very clear statement that, and I'm quoting here, Trump can't annex other countries. She also announced that Denmark is going to beef up its own military presence in the Arctic and even offered to work more closely with the U.S. to defend the area. So we see this tension building between the U.S. and Denmark, right? And then we're looking at how Colonel Meyers' actions kind of jumped right into the middle of it.
Now, connecting this back to the firing, this analysis from Just Security, it gives us a really valuable way to look at this. They're saying that Colonel Meyers being removed, it's part of a larger pattern of personnel changes going on in the Pentagon. And that raises concerns about, maybe there's this growing trend of politicization within the military leadership. And the fact that Just Security is seeing this as part of other recent firings of high-ranking officers, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is this just an isolated incident, or is something bigger shifting in how the military operates under this administration? Maybe they're starting to prioritize political loyalty over traditional military values.
And then adding yet another layer to all of this, fair observer, they criticized Vice President Vance's initial remarks. They said he was basically ignoring Greenland's right to, decide its own future. And they said this could seriously damage the U.S.'s relationship with Denmark. It really shows you how tricky it is trying to balance those strategic interests with respecting a country's right to be sovereign.
So, bringing it all together, what do you think are the key takeaways for our listeners from all of this?
Well, it seems like the main reason Colonel Meyers was fired was that email, right? That public disagreement with the vice president on something so politically sensitive, U.S. foreign policy, Greenland's future, and what the administration wants to do.
It really highlights that difficult position military commanders are in. I mean, they're responsible for their people, for getting the mission done. But then there's this expectation that they'll publicly support the political leadership, especially when it comes to international relations.
Absolutely. And this whole situation just shows you how complex, how constantly changing the U.S.'s relationship is with both Greenland and Denmark. Sure, they've got these long-standing ties, shared security interests, all that, but there are definitely different viewpoints, different priorities, especially when it comes to Greenland's political future and the Arctic becoming, so strategically important.
So for you listening, the big question is, what does all this tell us about how this administration deals with dissenting voices within the military? And what does it mean for their goals in the Arctic? This one event really feels like a snapshot of how military leadership, political agendas, and international relations all collide, especially in a region that's only going to become more important on the world stage.
That's a great point. I mean, thinking about Greenland wanting independence, Denmark's commitment to keeping Greenland, and the U.S. wanting more influence in the Arctic, how is this going to play out? What could be the long-term consequences, not just for the Arctic itself, but for global alliances and how countries navigate this increasingly, complex geopolitical landscape? Lots to think about.
For sure. It's a multifaceted situation, definitely nuanced, and we encourage you to keep thinking about all the different perspectives we've discussed today and see how this whole story develops. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.